All good? Okay. Well, Senator, first of all, thank you for giving us a few minutes. And kind of like I mentioned, the video of you taking off the mask yesterday, would love to kind of, talk about that pretty emotional move by you. And it seemed like you were pretty happy about it.
I really was. It's been a very difficult year for our country, and the changing of the regulations to better reflect science, I think, gave us all a lift. It also provides an important incentive for people to get vaccinated, because now they know that if they're fully vaccinated, they can more fully participate in life, that they don't have to wear a mask outdoors at all, and in most cases not indoors either. So this provides a real incentive for people who have been hesitant about getting the vaccination or thought, well, gee, it doesn't really give me any particular advantage, to go ahead and get it.
And the timing of, the U.S. CDC announcement coming just really a few hours before the Maine CDC and Governor Mills updated and relaxed some restrictions here. So the timing kind of conflicted, and it seems like that's been happening throughout this whole process. The federal level and the states aren't really on the same page. And do you think Maine should maybe take a page out of the U.S. CDC playbook here?
Well, it's been difficult for the state of Maine because naturally the state is going to look to the CDC for guidance. And unfortunately, the CDC guidance has lagged the science. And that has been a real problem. It's been a problem as far as reopening our schools, operating summer camps, and deciding where masks are needed in those three areas in particular. So it's made it a confusing situation for states to decide what their policies should be. To me, it is so important that the CDC keep up with the latest scientific evidence, because otherwise people will disregard the CDC guidelines that do make sense and that we should be following. That's why it's so important. It's important for the credibility of the CDC.
And just a few days ago, you said that you held the CDC as really the gold standard in public health. And obviously, just a few days ago, you said that not anymore. And I know that you said this was an overdue change. And when would you have liked to see these mask restrictions lifted? And is there another public health, entity in the country that you do see as a gold standard?
The CDC is the agency for which I've always had the greatest respect. But what I have seen is that the agency is not kept up with the latest scientific data, with the advice from public health experts from all over the country on everything from school openings to the operation of summer camps to the wearing of masks. So I hope this is a turning point for the CDC, because it's really important that Americans be able to have confidence in the CDC guidelines and recognize that they should be followed. And if they know that they're in conflict with the science, as they still are on school openings and on the operation of summer camps, then they're likely to disregard the valid CDC recommendations.
And so just to go back to a question I previously asked, is there, a public entity, a health entity that, you do kind of consider as a gold standard?
Well, I think the FDA has done a good job in approving vaccines after careful review, but quickly, and recognizing the urgency of getting vaccines out to the public. I think the FDA's done a good job, and I'm hopeful this is a glitch in the CDC's operations, and that it will learn from the mistakes that it has made. To be fair to the CDC, we've learned a lot about this virus over the last year. So some of the initial guidance, it makes sense that it would evolve over time. What has been frustrating to me is when the scientific consensus has been overwhelming, as it has been on the very, very low, virtually non-existent risk of transmission outdoors. And the CDC stuck to the mask guidelines. That's what needs to change. The CDC needs to show, and I would suggest it start with schools next and summer camps, that it can respond more quickly when the science is clear.
And obviously, hindsight is 2020 here. And you just mentioned before we started that you were able to walk your dog Pepper without a mask, and even before you felt, and you and a lot of Republican colleagues said, it should be common sense, not mandate all this. And when do you think that the outdoor mask mandates, or even just wearing a mask outdoors or really indoor settings, should it have been lifted earlier, or was now a right time? I know you said this was overdue, so I was wondering if you have a time frame in mind of this, when we should have been able to take these masks off outdoors.
The evidence for not having to wear masks out of doors has been strong for some time, for months. Indoors is a much more difficult calculation, and so I'm more sympathetic to the delay by the CDC in that area. And there are still some instances, like airplanes, where the CDC and the TSA are keeping the mask requirement in place, and that probably makes sense. After all, you don't know whether the people on the airplane have been vaccinated or not, where they have traveled, and it's an enclosed space. I would note that airplanes have very good ventilation systems, but still, I would understand and do understand keeping that particular requirement. My point is that in order to encourage people to follow that kind of guideline, the CDC needs to be more responsive when the science clearly shows that its guidelines are out of date. And that certainly was true for wearing masks out of doors for some time. In addition, the CDC was really misleading. It said that the chance of an outdoor transmission was under 10%. And it's true that the chance of an outdoor transmission in a casual encounter of someone on a street or at the next table at a restaurant is less than 10%. But what the CDC wasn't telling you is it was virtually non-existent. It was less than 0.01%. So it's not helpful when the CDC chooses a statistic that does not accurately represent the real risk. It's technically true, but highly misleading, as the New York Times pointed out.
And one more mask question. I know Speaker Pelosi said that House members will be wearing the masks until everyone is vaccinated. And has there been any conversations on the Senate side about you and your colleagues wearing masks in session?
There has not been any conversation. I do not know of anyone in the Senate who has not either been vaccinated or had COVID. Maybe there are some, but the House is a much larger body, and there may be more people who are unvaccinated, and they should continue wearing masks, but I'm not sure that applies to people who are fully vaccinated. In fact, I suspect that in the Senate, that most senators, since all of us, to my knowledge, have been vaccinated and a couple have had COVID, will choose to not wear their masks.
And another issue that keeps coming up throughout this pandemic is businesses, restaurant workers being the front lines and kind of being the ones to enforce all these mandates. And I was actually just at a local business that just opened up today in Bangor and asking about this, and they were saying, we don't really know what to do. And what is that another conflicting issue? Is that the Go ahead.
It's conflicting and confusing for a business or any other public entity to know exactly what to do right now because they are bound by the state's regulations. And the CDC made clear yesterday that they would defer to states in their decision making. So we'll see what the state decides to do. I know that no action was taken yesterday on the mask requirement by the states, but the CDC guidance had just come out. So I'm sure the governor and Dr. Shaw will be reviewing the new CDC guidance and then deciding what they're going to do as far as the mandates on businesses and other public entities.
And it also seems with President Biden's announcement yesterday that he and a lot of other people are putting a lot of trust in the American people here to say, if you are vaccinated, you can take the mask off, but there's really no way to prove it. So do you think that's the right approach? And do you support, a vaccine passport or some other way to kind of show that you are vaccinated?
Well, here's the advantage of the new regulations. They provide a real incentive for people to get the vaccine. And there wasn't an incentive before other than your own desire to safeguard your health and the health of people that you come into contact with. But if you were still required to stay away from family members that you hadn't seen in months, if you were required to stay 6 feet apart and wear a mask when you go out, that all of those were disincentives to getting vaccinated. So my hope is that the change to guidance by the CDC will encourage more people to get vaccinated. That's the way I look at it.
Do you support a vaccine passport or another form of proof that you were vaccinated? For especially someone like myself, where you're a younger adult, I am fully vaccinated, obviously with the mask off. But do you think there should be some sort of proof that you are vaccinated?
I think that should be left up to individual states, and there shouldn't be a federal mandate. I carry my white vaccine card with me in case anyone needs reassurance that I've been vaccinated. And I think that's a good practice, but I'm very wary of the federal government trying to set up some national vaccine passport. I don't think that's a good idea.
Dana might be able to give you, we found some vaccine card holders, but switching gears to the infrastructure conversations, and I know that's kind of where there's been a lot of meetings with, Senate leadership with President Biden, and where does the bargaining stand as of now? I know you left Washington last night, so was there a latest, update?
Yes, the leadership of both the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle had what everyone has described as a constructive meeting with the president yesterday. My hope is that the president will split his package, his $4.1 trillion package, into two parts. One to focus on what I would call physical and digital infrastructure, traditional core infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, seaports, highways, waterways, water treatment plants, and broadband. And then his social programs, I think, should be considered separately. If he does that, we have a greater chance of getting bipartisan support for a core infrastructure package. And so that's my hope.
And sticking to bipartisan support for voting reform that is also being worked into some bills down in Washington, do you think that there will be enough votes to get, or enough Republicans will vote to get the 60 votes needed to get this voter reform, or how is that standing right now?
There are certain campaign finance reforms that I support that are included in this sweeping, all-encompassing voting bill that would preempt the laws in each one of the 50 states, which I am not for. But what I am for is two particular provisions. One, requiring all groups, and I don't care if they're on the far left or the far right or in between, to disclose their donors. Dark money groups should have to disclose their donors so that people know who is financing groups like Maine Momentum and groups that are putting ads on television. And I also believe there's a federal role to be played in the security of our voting machines to keep them protected from the Russians trying to hack into databases of voters. So there is another area where I think a federal role is appropriate. I don't think it's appropriate for the federal government to dictate to the states what the voting rules should be in a particular state. We do have the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s on the book. It should be enforced to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to vote who is qualified to vote. I was pleased to see that Angus King voted against ballot harvesting, which is included in this bill. That would allow partisans to go to individual houses and pick up absentee ballots. I don't think that's a good idea at all. But there are many other provisions of the bill that are also troubling. I don't think at a time when our debt is soaring and inflation is going up, that the American taxpayers need to be paying for my election or any other federal official's election. So I do not support public financing at the federal level. As one of my conservative colleagues, Ted Cruz, said, do you really think liberal taxpayers want to contribute $20 million to my reelection? And I think the answer is pretty clearly no in that particular case. But in general, I don't think that that is a burden that should be put on the taxpayers. I also don't think that the Federal Elections Commission should be turned into a partisan enforcement agency. Right now, it has an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, and that's the way that it should be. It should not be a partisan agency.
And a more, Maine-specific question. Obviously, Governor Mills is very adamant about green energy and renewable energy, and something we've been covering a lot is the potential for offshore wind power. And I know the traditional lobstermen and fishermen are very much against this. Where do you stand on Maine looking towards that offshore wind as we move into the future?
Well, just yesterday, we had a hearing in the Senate to look at some of the green energy applications for transportation. And Dr. Habib Dagher from the University of Maine, who is so brilliant in coming up with composite materials that will reduce the carbon footprint, testified, and he's been very active in offshore wind. I think we can accommodate the needs of our lobstermen and fishermen and offshore wind. We're talking about windmills that ultimately will be placed pretty far offshore, and our lobstermen tend to catch their lobsters in the inshore area. And the governor has already said that she does not anticipate offshore wind within the state's control, but rather in federal waters. So I think we can work out accommodations for both the exciting promise of offshore wind and meeting the essential needs of our lobster men and women. The lobster industry, believe me, is way more concerned about possible gear changes and closures as a result of possible regulations at the federal level dealing with protecting the right whale, despite the fact that there has not been a case where a right whale has been entangled in lobster gear in more than a decade.
Right, there seems to be enough ocean for everybody here. And switching gears one more time back to more Washington things, but with Representative Cheney being removed from her leadership position with a voice vote the other day, what can, Republicans here in Maine, Republican voters across the country, where is the confidence level in the GOP right now as I just said, Representative Cheney was removed from her position in a voice vote, no one going on the record. Is there still confidence for the party?
The Republican Party has to be a big tent party. It should not be controlled by just one person, and we need to remember that the reason that we're Republicans is we're bound together by certain fundamental principles, a belief in individual responsibility, in personal freedom, in small business, in free markets, in a strong national defense. Those are just some of the principles that bind us together. I would encourage my Republican colleagues to remember what Ronald Reagan always said, and that is that a person who agrees with you 85% of the time is your friend, not your enemy. It's ironic that Liz Cheney is actually being replaced by a member of the caucus who's far less conservative than Liz Cheney is. So I think we need to remember that there's room for conservatives, for moderates, for people who like President Trump, for people who like other rising candidates. There's room for everybody in our party. We should not be pushing people out. We should be welcoming people in.
And you mentioned the Republican Party wants to cast that big tent and not one person. Is the one person in control, is it still President Donald Trump? Is he still the number one figure in the GOP?
Certainly President Trump has a devoted following in the party. There are other leaders in the party, Nikki Haley, for example, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton. There are Chris Christie. There are a lot of leaders in the party who also have devoted followings. So we'll see what happens, but I think there are a lot of leaders out there of the party.
And the last thing for you, Senator Collins, obviously, you just kind of mentioned that there's a lot of passionate followers and devout followers for former President Trump and everyone that you just mentioned. And it looks like Representative Cheney was ousted at cancel culture, whatever you want to say, because she's speaking out against the quote big lie of that the election was stolen. And is it difficult to see somebody in your party spreading the truth about the election be, removed from her leadership position for speaking out against the former president, or how do you kind of see that all play out?
Well, first let me say, if there's one thing I've learned in my years in Washington, it's that the House doesn't like to have advice from the Senate, and obviously the House has the right to choose their own leaders. I consider Liz Cheney and Elise Stefanik to be people whom I admire, and I consider Liz to be a woman of strength and character who did what she felt was the right thing. And but the House gets to choose its own leaders. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Do I get to ask a question?
If you have anything.
I'm just curious to know, what are you looking forward to for the rest of the agenda for this spring before you all take your summer break?
Getting a robust core infrastructure package passed is one of my highest priorities. It's really important that we expand broadband. We've seen in this pandemic how difficult it was for the rural areas of our state to access high-speed internet at an affordable price, and that made it difficult for telemedicine, for hybrid learning, and for people to be working at home in the earlier stages of the pandemic. I travel all over the state, so I'm very familiar with the condition of our roads and bridges, and we do need a major investment. But I would not do as the president is proposing that we do, and that is subsidize electric vehicles to the tune of $174 billion. That's more than the president is proposing to spend on roads, highways, and bridges combined. And that doesn't make sense to me. So I think we need to rewrite his plan to narrow its scope, to lower the cost, and to figure out how we're going to pay for it. And that's going to take a lot of work, but I really hope we can get there and get to a bipartisan package. I am really concerned about the amount of money that is being spent, and already we've seen inflation go up at an alarming rate last month, over 4%. The price of lumber has doubled. Other commodities have increased in price. And I'm concerned that the size of the president's package, when you add that to the $1.9 trillion COVID package, when you add that to the $4 trillion in COVID relief that was spent last year, much of which was needed, that we're getting to a real tipping point. And this excessive spending is beginning to spur inflation, and that in turn is going to lead to higher interest rates. So I think we have to really be careful here and lower the cost of the president's plan.